My story, just very briefly, is that I was raised in an extremely militant atheist family. My parents were actually members of the American Communist Party back in the 30s, and I was brought up uh, as I guess what today is called a strong atheist position. In other
Hmm.
words, I was absolutely positive that there was no God, God could not exist. Very anti-theistic. I was taught that religion is not only wrong but actually evil,
Yeah.
one of the worst evils in world history. Some of this, many of your audience have probably heard from modern atheists, but at the time that I was growing up, it was kind of rare.
Hmm.
I went into science. My father had been a chemist, and I studied biochemistry, got a PhD, began working in research, and I've always been very interested in science in general, from just even a philosophical standpoint.
Hmm.
I had and continue to have a scientific worldview. I believe that the natural world is most easily and most appropriately understood by scientific research.
Hmm.
But there were aspects of what I was learning about science, physics first, and then later biology, that made me question my original atheist faith. And I call it a faith on purpose because it was something that, at least my version of it, was something that you had to believe in. It had dogmas, it had schisms, it had
Yeah.
everything that other religions have. But I began doubting the whole premise of it. The idea that materialism can answer everything stopped making sense to me.
Hmm.
Now, that didn't bring me to Christianity. It didn't even bring me to believe in God, but it did lead me to question my initial uh, belief that the world and everything in the world could be explained and understood and rationalized simply on materialistic, naturalistic
Hmm.
causes. I can go into more of the details of how that
Yeah,
happened
sure.
later, but um, so that period lasted decades. When I wouldn't even, I guess
Wow.
I call me an agnostic, where I didn't think about religion. I was very busy with my career. I was
Right.
trying to learn, move up the ladder in academia, and I didn't really think much about God at all. But at a certain point, I started to wonder about, if I had given up, which I knew I had, my materialistic worldview, what worldview could I substitute it for? And I started looking into all kinds of things, spirituality in general, some of the things that you will see in New Age religion type stuff. I mean, I never went into the kooky things, but like pyramids and
Yeah.
all that nonsense. But I was interested in all kinds of stuff. I mean, I started reading the Kabbalah, uh, just for the mystical viewpoint. I started looking into Zen Buddhism. I was kind of a typical person of that period,
Yeah.
looking for some meaning, some spiritual meaning outside of my scientific career. Um, the way I became a Christian eventually, and it took quite a while, and it was about maybe 15, 20 years ago. I met people who were Christians, and I went to a Catholic church, actually. First time I'd ever been to a church. I was in my 40s, and I was terrified and quite, on guard. I expected the priest to start pointing directly at me and, sinner,
Yeah.
what are you doing here? And I was amazed at what I actually found, which was sermons about love
Hmm.
and no judgment. I mean, I was lucky. I mean, I've heard other people,
Right.
especially people who were Christian and then left, talk about being abused from the pulpit. I have to say that I've been to many churches since then, Catholic, Baptist, non-denominational, Methodist. I am a Methodist now.
Okay.
I have never heard that. So I've been very fortunate, I suppose. I have never experienced the kind of negative feelings that so many ex-Christians report as they become atheists. Um, so I guess I've been lucky. But my experience at the church led me to question not just the general idea of materialism being everything, but my whole concept about religion, that religion, especially Christianity, was the evil of
Yeah.
history. And I started reading. And one of the things I started reading was the Gospels
Hmm.
and other parts of the Bible. And my reaction to that was the same thing as it was when I went to church. My reaction was, well, wait a minute, this isn't so bad.
Right.
This doesn't sound wrong. This doesn't sound fake. This sounds really real. I
Yeah.
mean, why would, if the Bible were all made up, why would the writers of the Bible write things about themselves and their ancestors that were not very nice?
Right.
You know, why, why is King David portrayed as the human being he was? Probably not as some perfect hero as you
Right.
usually see in fiction. But what really impressed me were the Gospels. I When I read the Gospels and then the Book of Acts, it was incredibly convincing to me. And I have since, in many debates that I've had with atheists, heard all kinds of stories about why the Gospels are not real and made up, and they just don't ring. They didn't ring true to me then, and they don't certainly don't ring true to me now. Those arguments are desperate arguments. Instead, what we have is a group of writings that describe something that to me seemed like it really took place.
Hmm.
And I remember seeing recently the movie by Lee Strobel,
Oh, it's a good
and
movie. Yeah.
yeah, Case for Christ. And I kind of went through that. I quote did my research.
Hmm.
And starting with the Gospels and then books about them and then arguments against them, I wasn't convinced that the Gospels were wrong. In fact, I started thinking maybe this is all true, although I couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
And the reason I couldn't believe it was because I was still a scientist and the resurrection is magical and et cetera, et
Yeah.
cetera. So I wasn't there yet, but I was very interested in Christianity. And the reason I was so interested was the story is so beautiful.
Yeah.
Let's say it is fiction. Still, it's a beautiful fiction, is what I thought.
Right.
I mean, here you have a man who is a simple carpenter who, you know, had a ministry for about 3 years in which he gave a message to the people that was incredibly revolutionary. I began wondering why the communists were anti-Christian. I mean, more revolutionary than Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Love your neighbor and give everything you have to the poor. I mean, who told me? Nobody ever told me about that part.
Right.
And I thought it was a very beautiful story. And of course, the resurrection itself was incredibly powerful and moving. And the book of Acts is written like history. I mean, you just read it, it was not made up. Anyway, still, it was extremely hard for me to give myself to Christ
Right.
because it just felt, went against my worldview. What changed all that was, and this I think is probably happens with many people. I've heard it said by others. I had several dreams. Interestingly enough, the first of these dreams happened when I was quite young and still an atheist. And it was a dream which I can't describe very well, but it was a dream of tremendous joy. And what I now know, it was a dream of the next world. I had no idea that was what it was when I had it. I woke up with this feeling of joy that I couldn't explain.
Hmm.
And I was able to call on whenever I needed it. I would remember the dream and I would feel joyful. I had no idea what it was about. But later on, when I was thinking about Christianity, I had two dreams that were clearly about Jesus, where Jesus came and taught me things. And that made a big impression on me, and I began wondering if perhaps there was some way that I could believe in Christ and still hold on to my scientific worldview, but I didn't know how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But I was getting more and more interested, and finally, one day, I was driving a long distance, about 6 hour drive, and I was in a region of the country, quite rural, and I turned on the radio, and I got one of these preachers, one of the radio preachers. It was a Christian station, and I'd always turn those off whenever I heard them.
Yeah, of course.
But this time I decided, well, let me hear what he's saying. And I really wasn't listening to his words very much, but I was very struck by his delivery,
Mm-hmm.
by the cadences of his speech. And he was a good preacher. And, good preachers can really preach.
Yeah.
And and I was very impressed with that. And after a few minutes, though, I turned it off because I really wasn't listening. But I started thinking to myself, I like to talk. I wonder if I could preach a sermon.
Yeah.
I never thought of this before. And while I was driving, I began preaching to myself a sermon. And the words that came into my mind, and I don't remember if I said them out loud or not, I don't know. But the words that came into my mind were nothing that I had ever thought about before.
Right.
And I preached the entire sermon. It was not very long. I've written it down. It's about a page or two.
Yeah.
And it was all about love, and that Jesus Christ loves me, even me, sinner that I have been for over 40 years. And when I was done preaching that to myself, I had to pull the car over, and I was in tears.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew that I was a Christian.
Wow.